member sends his love and his support for the work that you have and continue to do within distressed communities. It's in that spirit that this afternoon I'd like to discuss the plight of the truly disadvantaged by sharing with you an overview of the city of Chicago, often called Chi-Town, city of broad shoulders, among other things. Besides the importance of place, policy, as it relates to creating opportunities, and the need for more programs like Fifth City in light of the social economic trends that's affecting communities across the country. This is a map of the city of Chicago, and you'll see that Chicago is known for a lot of things. It's pretty much the Midwest global city. The financial institutions, all the characteristics synonymous to global cities. We have 2.8 million people, or 12,750 people per square mile. And Chicago is the world's 26th largest metropolitan area.
It went off and it's warming up.
Okay, so just keep that picture in your head. And for those of you who got a glimpse of the pink area, that's the west side. So think pink when it materializes again. But meanwhile, I'll just move forward in the spirit of time, in the sake of time. So when we look at the Chicagoland area, the question then becomes, well, what about the people? Chicago is known for being very diverse and cultural, among other things, and over the past few decades, they've undergone changes synonymous with globalization and gentrification. And we need to keep in mind that during the course of these changes, that there were policy decisions and movements going on at the same time. And I've taken a liberty of chronicling some of those key policies and movements. In 1964, we had the Civil Rights Act passed that outlined the racial segregation in schools, workplace, and facilities, and general public. 1966, the Northern Civil Rights Movement, which was based in North Lawndale, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in April of 1968, the fall of 1968 emergence of the Black Panthers in Chicago, and then more importantly, going back to the assassination of Dr. King, the rioting that followed. There was a lot of damage done to the West Side, specifically in communities that were predominantly African American. In the 1970s, we had the open housing laws, which contributed to a large exodus of blacks from the direct distressed communities, again, from the riots, who were moving to more nourishing communities, as understandable, that will provide education, that will provide a conducive environment for the children, that will provide parks and a conducive neighborhood for the well-being and the development of their children. In 1972, there was the War on Drugs prohibition. The food stamp program, now called the SNAP, was made available in 1975. In the 1980s, the Tough on Crime sentencing reform laws. And then in 1988, the Family Support Act, calling for more mutual obligation in providing public assistance. And then in 1996, you had the passage of welfare reform, which altered AFDC to TANF and capped the funding. And then lastly, the 1998 Reauthorization of Higher Education Act of 1965 bans on financial assistance for individual convicted of possession of drugs. Now, the purpose of sharing these public policies with you is to help you understand that during the course of globalization and gentrification, there were overarching issues going on nationally. Again, place, policy, opportunities. So by definition, when you look at a lot of the policies that I've mentioned, they're pretty much race-oriented. They came with their share of challenges. For example, the open housing laws. I don't know how many of you are familiar with William Julius Wilson's study on the growth of poverty in the 77 community areas, where he examined the effects of this as well as the civil rights law that led to, again, an exodus of Black Americans, middle-class Black Americans, and then you had a higher concentration of individuals who were living in poverty, lower income families. And what happened to those communities is that you had children who had once seen adults on the corner, dressed in suits, going to work, getting educations, being within an environment where it was self-sustaining, where you had doctors, you had lawyers, you had dentists, shift from a community that was self-sufficient to a community that was depressed, that was recuperating from riots of 1968, and more importantly, an increase in crime and drug activity. And in his study, Wilson found that during the course of this, then you had the exodus of industries and businesses closing. You had Sears, Sunbeam closing, and in Illinois, and particularly on the west side, was an industrial community. So you had also Sunbeam and International Harvester who closed down. So you need to understand by how can I say, by our lineage, African Americans have always been laborers and blue-collar workers. And more importantly, when those jobs, those industries closed, it compromised their ability to sustainable and gainful employment. So what I'd like to do now is point out, this is the Midwest, the West Side, this area here. And when you look at the bullets that I provide for you, and I apologize for blocking you guys, but I'm multitasking between clicking and reading it and everything. But I just like to draw on some of the highlights and the profiles of these communities. Again, keeping in mind the policies that I provided to you from a period of 1960 to now, just to share with you the disturbing and sobering trends that are taking place. In Westtown, the current demographics is 58% whites and 47% Hispanics. They've always had a long, sustained and strikingly diverse population, and until of late, when there was an entrance of artists, students, and restaurants, and nightclubs and shops in the limelight, that led to the exodus of low-income residents who moved to areas further north and west to escape the gentrification. Now, the arrows, or should I say the question marks at the top, are there because what has happened over time is that when you hear West Side, depending on where you're from, naturally in the news in the city of Chicago, West Side is synonymous with crime, drugs, among other social economic walls and ills. But the reality is West Side is not a community, it's a series of communities, which includes the Loop, the Magnificent Mile, it's in that area, the University of Illinois, Cook County Medical District, Illinois Medical District, but you never hear it in that capacity, and so therefore when you hear it or when it's announced on the news, if you watch the local news, there's been a shooting on the near West Side. And so individuals are trying to disassociate themselves with the West Side because the stereotypes are starting to follow them. But then at the same time, you have globalization and gentrification that's changing the faces of the community. And you'll see that and note that within the sound bites that I provided. Also, the communities with asterisks beside them, those are the communities that experienced hard times with the riots of 1968. They were the communities that were hardest hit. And if you'll note, those communities, specifically East Garfield, West Garfield, Austin, Lundale, both South and North, They are communities that are occupied by low-income minorities. For example, South Lawndale, 97% Hispanics. North Lawndale, 94% African Americans. Austin, 90% Black, 6% white, 4% Hispanics. West Garfield area, 98% Black. East Garfield area, 97.2 Black. Each of these communities face and had the same trends: residential overcrowding, drugs, crime, poor educational systems, and more importantly, lands that have gone undeveloped till this day. Now, importantly, one of the characteristics of globalization is an influx of white collars who take residency and push and change the face of the current residents who can no longer stay there. So when you have development of these gated communities that they've been called, it raises the property taxes. So that means the mom and pa who were there from the very origins of the beginning, who raised their children there and saw them grow, they can't afford the property taxes. And more importantly, there's crime all around them. And they're not also in a position to, one, get out and get involved in the concept of what has worked in the past, and that is, it takes a village to raise a child. So you have other trends going on now in addition to these laws, and these laws have directly impacted low-income minorities. You have African American women being incarcerated at an equally higher rate as men. You have an increase in the prison pipeline as it relates to the juveniles. You have an increase in the foster care pipeline. So what's happening is that you're finding these children are either going to foster care or being cared for by the elderlies. Elderlies, for the most part, who do not receive assistance and funding from government to help them take care of the children. Elderlies who aren't necessarily mobile and able to get around and provide for themselves, let alone go to the school and check on the children and see if they are in school or not, and to keep track of them as far as their activities in and about in the community.
So then we have
Fifth City, the Iron Man, who stands there today still in East Garfield Park. During a time of overcrowding, unemployment, poor educational opportunities, jobs, Fifth City made a commitment to work with residents of East Garfield Park. Again, keeping in mind all the policies that have been passed down through the decades, the conditions that they've been living in, the structural constraints that persist from race, from segregation, and then more importantly, the closing of businesses and industries from the 1968 riot, and more importantly, globalization. So when you look at the work and the services that they provided during the 60s, it's profound. Can you imagine what this would do today, given today's current recession and the challenges that are facing low-income Americans across the country? Can you imagine the impact of going into communities, distressed communities, where children have lost hope because they are either going home to a single parent or to their grandmothers or grandfather? Can you imagine what this would do to an individual who was attempting to reintegrate back into society after being formally convicted of a crime, who's trying to find a job, who's trying to reconnect with their families? Can you imagine the importance of housing? Housing, given this whole wave of globalization. With the housing market, there have been a lot of foreclosures in the city of Chicago because of predatory lending. And we're finding that not only are those who purchase houses being displaced, but those who are living in residential buildings whose whose owners are not paying their mortgages. So through no fault of their own, they're paying their rent, but they're being put out because the owner of the property, the slumlord, has decided to walk away from it. So there are a range of issues that's impacting society. And if you want to know just how well we're doing in society, more importantly, if you were to measure the U.S. wealth by the well-being of our children, specifically African American children, the results would be sobering. The statistics speak for themselves. Children are a product of their environment. The well-being of the child is a reflection of the well-being of the parents. These statistics revealed a disturbing trend. Not only do you have children experiencing higher rates of poverty, now you have single heads of household women experiencing higher rates of poverty. And a lot of these women who've been incarcerated or trying to return back to society are having a hard time getting their children back that was taken away from them because they've been incarcerated for more than 18 months. They're having a hard time finding housing because of prohibition housing laws that do not allow individuals who've been formerly incarcerated or relatives of individuals who've been incarcerated to stay with them. So what's happening is that you're having a cycle, a vicious cycle, recidivism. The children are relying on their lives and turning to gains for their family. The community is distressed, and ultimately the deterioration of the family unit. This is a call to action. It's a privilege to work with the Honorable Danny K. Davis. In the time that I've worked with him, I've been blessed with the opportunity to spearhead legislation like the Second Chance Act that helps individuals try to reintegrate successfully in society by providing them jobs, social services to help them reconnect with their family, housing, which has proven to be vital to reducing recidivism, and then job placement. We're currently working on another piece of legislation called the Julia Carson Responsible Fatherhood and Healthy Families Act. This cuts to the heart of TANF welfare reform. And we have to really understand how public policies affect your ability as a faith-based initiative to do the work that you're doing. Oftentimes, there are burdens placed on residents or individuals seeking assistance that they're not in a position to provide or even fulfill. For example, spatial mismatch. How can you expect someone to find a job when they don't have the skills? And the skills that they have, there are no jobs available for those skills. And then more importantly, they're returning to a community that doesn't have adequate transportation so that they can have access to jobs outside their community. And then you have the piece where there's bylaws and prohibitions where the mother or the custodian is required to provide the specifics on the father for the child support enforcement, whom often the fathers whose license are being taken away from them because they're in arrearages with child support. Without a license, you can't work. And then also the deadbeat dad law, fathers are being locked up because they're behind in their child support cases, child support arrearages. Also, it's important to know that a lot of the policies you think come from the federal government really lie at the state level. Yes, it's true that we established the legislation and we put overarching parameters in place, but it's incumbent upon the state themselves to customize the legislation to adhere to the needs and the trends of their respective states. And this applies to TANF welfare. This applies to reentry for those who've been formerly incarcerated. This applies to those who've been convicted of drug crimes. This applies to the education. So when you look at these key areas, education, housing, assistance, they're vital to maintaining self-sufficiency. Without that, these people will resort to other means. And so that makes your job even more challenging. Because in understanding the structural constraints, again, predated to segregation, that's often impacting the cultural constraints, how a person perceives their conditions and their situation, how they respond to it, how they see their lives every day within a community where there are vacant lots, poor school systems, no playgrounds, no libraries, and marginal stores and businesses within their community. It impacts and compromises your ability to be more effective. So therefore, as you go forth in continuing the legacy, you must keep in mind place, policies, when you try to go forth and create opportunities for your target group. And so with that, I'd like to open the floor for any questions that you might have on my presentation. Thank you.